The theme of our India session today is how do you prosper in a net zero economy? And for that, to kick it off, we are delighted and honored to welcome our keynote speaker. He will speak on the topic of a paradigm shift, the net zero opportunity for India. He is none other than Satya Tripathi, the Secretary General at the Global Alliance for a Sustainable Planet, and formerly the UN Assistant Secretary General and head of the New York office of UN Environment. Satya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, based on where you are. It's a rare privilege for me to be speaking to to fellow Indians across the planet. And I deem it a privilege because this is the first time I'm doing it. And I have been at it for a while as an international civil servant until 2 weeks ago, when I decided to move to the Global Alliance for a Sustainable Planet as its first Secretary General. The power of the Indian diaspora, or for that matter, any diaspora, is underemphasized mostly, and it is time we leveraged our strengths and showcased the best of us across the planet in support of people and planet. And of course, in that conversation, India holds center stage. Let me explain why. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge the amazing champions that are going to be speaking in different sessions today. I have had the privilege of knowing many of them. And of course, at the end of it, you'll be hearing some beautiful music, the Earth song from Ricky Cage. And you will see that the song and the music is as soulful and pure as the people and the thoughts it represents. Let me start by talking a bit about where India is in the global context. Now, India's per capita emissions are about 1.9 tons, as opposed to the ideal average that should be about 2.1 tons per capita. That's what IPCC tells us. So in that sense, Indians are actually performing well. They're under the ideal average that we ought to be at. But the trouble is that we are doubling roughly every 9 to 10 years, as has been evidenced in the last decade. So with that, we would easily surpass any of the largest emitters, the two ahead of us, that is China and the United States, in a few decades, if not earlier. But also the challenge is that what is it doing to us? What is the cost of climate mitigation and adaptation for India? India may not have played a big part or even a small part in the challenge that confronts humanity, but India will certainly have to play a critical part in amending all the wrongs that have been done to Mother Earth over the last 100 years or so. And when we talk about net zero, many people frame it as a challenge. I frame it as an opportunity. When people frame it as a challenge, what they say is that, well, it was never India's problem to solve. That's the broader context in which people talk. And they would be basically telling the truth that India really didn't contribute much to the global pollution. The global carbon budget for a 2-degree future is about 2,900 gigatons. And we are roughly 300 short of shooting past that milestone, in which you will not be able to stay at a under 2 degrees Celsius global warming scenario by the turn of the century. Forget the turn of the century. The World Meteorological Organization a few months ago came up with this latest report, which tells us actually we have a 70% chance of getting to 1.5 degrees of global warming in the next 5 years. And then that would have a telling effect on countries with coastlines, countries with all kinds of entrenched indicators that actually make it impossible for people to get out of the poverty trap. And of course, we well know, being Indians, that India has about 7,200 kilometers of coastline, and most of the impoverished, the vulnerable, the poor that depend on artisanal and coastal fisheries for their protein needs are all living along the coastline. So when the sea levels rise, and mind you, we're at 415 parts per million of carbon concentration in the atmosphere. Last time we were anywhere near these kind of numbers was 3 million years ago. And at that time, the sea levels were actually 20 meters higher. And of course, people ask you the counter question, the skeptics, so why aren't we seeing those levels of sea level rise? Because this has all happened in 100 years time, too short a time frame. And of course, you will see all those impacts cascading, and we're already seeing them actually. If you look at the Arctic ice shelves literally breaking apart, the size of continental ice shelves, and melting 30 times faster than they were in the 80s and the 90s. So the evidence is staring us in our face. Now, what's the opportunity for India? Now, the opportunity is this. When people say that I'll get to net zero by 2060 or 2050 or 2045, as is the case of Sweden, it's all great. But I have a different experience, unfortunately. I call it greenwash, because if you look at something that I was involved in 2015, the New York Declaration on Forests, a lot of big corporations came together and said, we're going to really do something that will be miraculous in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. Lots of promises. In 2020, we did a study, a lot of partner organizations, of course, coming together, and we found that those promises counted for precious little. And so when people say that net zero without common measures, without common standards, it is really difficult to understand what people mean by net zero. It's a great conversation. As I often say, the road to nothing is peppered with great conversations. That's what has been happening for the last 30 years in the climate conversations. We've had some great COPs and some not so great COPs, the conferences of parties, and we produced precious little in terms of results. Now, are these conversations important? Of course they are. They're very important. Countries, stakeholders all need to come together and speak with each other, because when we stop speaking, we start fighting. So that's a great thing to have. But we also need to produce action that the planet desperately needs, and the planet, our motherland, India, desperately needs. And in that, Jane was talking a little while earlier about the Dahlberg report that came out just this morning. $95 billion of economic impact for air pollution in India. 2019 Lancet report that came out last year tells us that we're losing 1.67 million people. That's 16.7 lakhs. People die every year due to air pollution. Now, in that report, there's hope, because they say that compared to the 90s, if you look at it now, we have actually saved 64% people that were dying of indoor air pollution, domestic air pollution. Our mothers and our sisters who stay at home and mostly do the cooking in very unhealthy circumstances. That has changed because science has helped. The energy efficient cook stoves, the Ujjwala program of the government of India, that has really engineered a paradigm shift. So there are these examples of we actually doing exponentially well in some of the areas, whereas the other areas we haven't. So what's the opportunity for India here? Now, India, of course, has agriculture, which counts for 18% of the emissions. Scientists tell us that by 2030, we'll be at 515 million tons of emissions from the agriculture sector. Now, something revolutionary is happening in India. If you look at Andhra Pradesh, they're doing something called the community managed natural farming program, where the input costs are dropping exponentially and the output keeps increasing steadily over crop cycle. And then what is happening is that as of today, 1 million farmers have changed behavior. When we, the so-called wise and intelligent people, get around these conversations and talk about risks, we forget that there are people whose resilience is this little, who live from one crop cycle to another crop cycle, and their entire families and their children, their schooling and their nutrition, everything depends on it. They are willing to change behavior, despite the fact that the resilience is this little and ours is this big. So we really need to take inspiration from these smallholder farmers in different landscapes in India, not just Andhra Pradesh, Himachal Pradesh, Sikkim, Maharashtra, Karnataka, and different parts of the states around the country, And these numbers add up to almost 3 million farmers that have changed behavior, but that's still a small number. We have 120 million smallholders, 160 million hectares of cropland in India. Imagine what happens when everybody changes behavior. India could actually produce not just the mitigation of the 515 million tons by 2030, but it can also produce carbon sequestration, amazing numbers. Because as we know, the soil could hold 3 times as much carbon as there is in the atmosphere. So if we can do that through sustainable agriculture, through natural farming, and through organic farming as well, although that's a much more expensive option, that could change. Anita talked about the burning of crop biomass and the work that TNC and other partners are doing in North India. That could actually change the paradigm if we can find a business model where we take all the crop biomass, convert it into bioenergy, biogas, compressed natural gas, or compressed biogas as they call it. And the government has a serious program, and we are working with the Ministry of Petroleum and Biofuels on that. And then last but not the least, the 63 million small and medium enterprises in India that contribute a lot to the problem, but very little to the solution, because nobody is really thinking of them as a part of the solution. They're at best a problem on the fringes, or at worst, a problem that we can forget about. But it is time to actually respect their contributions to the economy, which is phenomenal, the employment, both in the formal and the informal sector. And if we work with them to aggregate their problems and find system scale solutions, and it's not really rocket science. Pick up a few districts, break the back of the problem, find what gives, produce solutions and the resources. And that's why we founded the Global Alliance for a Sustainable Planet. We intend to produce $1 trillion of development impact in the next 10 years. And we're starting with India. We're working on a $10 billion climate adaptation fund, because mitigation is somebody else's problem, honestly. It's the world that has produced the emissions, and India cannot be expected to provide the solutions to that mitigation challenge. India should certainly provide solutions to the adaptation challenge, because it has to deal with its own problems: the air pollution, the unsustainable agriculture, the ecosystems that are literally disintegrating as I speak, and of course, the public health crisis that aids and abets COVID-19 kind of diseases, because zoonotic diseases affect those that are much more immunocompromised, which is a lot of people in our own country. So the solutions are there. And when other countries are desperately looking for residual emissions that they can, basically they need somebody else to produce the carbon sequestration numbers or the mitigation numbers that they can get the offsets for them, India could be at the front of the line, producing hundreds of billions of dollars of offsets by both saving its people, its public health, its ecosystems, and becoming a resurgent country, while of course serving the rest of the world with the offsets. So we have a tremendous opportunity, and the diaspora has an amazing role to play in it. We look forward to working with you in capitalizing and actualizing that promise. Thank you.